Today, I want to examine why lazy but ambitious people behave the way they do. So we've done a lot of research, and it's not what you think it is. It's actually something much deeper. So I'll point out 3 psychological patterns that define lazy but ambitious people. The first pattern you exhibit is you have grand visions of what you want to accomplish, but you can't sustain effort for more than a few weeks at a time. Second pattern that's revealing is you're obsessed with finding the perfect system, the ideal productivity method, the optimal strategy. You think if you just discover the right framework, everything will click into place and success will flow effortlessly. And the third pattern that's diagnostic is that you experience intense shame cycles around your inability to execute. Specifically, you alternate between grandiose fantasies of future success and crushing self-hatred about your current inaction. Right? You're either the hero of your own future story or you're worthless. There's no middle ground. But as we'll discuss, that's revealing because this psychological pattern is actually a recognized syndrome in depth psychology. You'd understand yourself completely differently if you knew what this actually is. You'd realize this isn't about willpower or discipline. So what you should really understand is that lazy but ambitious is a coherent psychological type. Because once you understand this pattern, you're far more likely to find actual solutions instead of trying the same failed productivity hacks. Modern productivity advice doesn't make sense when you see. It assumes a different psychological structure. What's actually happening is a split in the psyche, right? What's actually operating is a defense mechanism against feared inadequacy. You want grandiosity without the vulnerability of real effort. You want the identity of ambitious person without the risk of actually failing at something. The psychological establishment identified this lazy but ambitious pattern decades ago, and which manifests in millions of people today because it's a predictable response to specific developmental failures. Does that make sense? The main challenge psychoanalysts faced was patients who clearly wanted success but couldn't maintain effort. And the prevailing view was that people who didn't work simply lacked virtue or character. But then psychoanalysts started noticing a pattern. They saw patients with high intelligence, clear ambitions, but total inability to sustain productive work. And so suddenly they realized this wasn't about character. And so now psychologists studying these cases could see this was a psychological structure, but they needed to understand what caused it. Okay, and this is where depth psychology becomes illuminating, because conscious desire couldn't overcome unconscious resistance. So what happened? Well, what happened was that analysts started to identify 3 specific psychological mechanisms. So now what's going to happen is you will have the identification of narcissistic defense, perfectionism as self-protection, and shame grandiosity splitting, mainly. Now, for you to understand why intelligent people can't execute despite ambition, we need to look into this study, right? So the analysts, because they saw patients who avoided real effort, decided to investigate what psychological function this served. They discovered these patients protected a grandiose self-image by avoiding tests of reality, maintained fantasy of future greatness precisely by not acting in the present, used laziness as a defense against discovering they might be ordinary, and kept ambition in the realm of fantasy where it couldn't be disproven. Second mechanism that was identified was the patients had been saying they wanted perfect conditions before starting. But analysts realized this was a defense, not a preference. Now, the underlying function was to protect against the narcissistic injury of producing merely good work, because that's intolerable to the grandiose self, right? You could never start if conditions weren't perfect. You could also never be criticized if you never produced anything. And the reason why this worked psychologically is that it maintained the possibility of perfection in fantasy and protected against confronting actual limitations. Now, and because of this, what's happening is that the lazy but ambitious type and the creative underachievers, they are becoming more and more common, frustrated, and stuck in modern society. And now that you have this psychological understanding, the cultural narrative is going to completely miss this. So the traditional understanding was based on moral failure, where people who didn't work hard were just lazy and lacked character. Now, modern productivity culture and its influencers needed to sell solutions to make the problem seem fixable with simple interventions. And so they developed shallow narratives, or we call them habit formation and motivation techniques. But the main thing you need to know is that millions and millions of people suffer from this pattern. In fact, some estimates suggest 15 to 20% of intelligent, educated people exhibit this lazy but ambitious syndrome. And so this creates enormous suffering, because if you're trapped in this pattern and trying everything but nothing works, why do you keep failing, right? How do you make sense of this? So what's going to happen is this. Psychology is going to develop more sophisticated understanding, mid-20th century onward. In this period, psychologists like Heinz Kohut and Otto Kernberg elaborate the narcissistic personality structure, and they provide developmental explanations for how it forms. And so you're like, what did they discover? What did they learn about why this pattern develops in some people but not others? And so the thing you need to understand is that throughout this psychological research, what emerged is that this pattern has specific childhood origins. The structure forms in early development, and this is the key insight. But the real reason is specific developmental failures in childhood create a narcissistic structure that makes sustained effort psychologically impossible. So in this arrangement, what happens is that the child's sense of self becomes dependent on maintaining an inflated self-image. And so this creates the need to avoid reality tests. What people don't appreciate is that the real reason why this matters is children who experience specific parenting failures develop this structure, the developmental trauma. So what happens instead is parents either over-idealize the child without supporting actual competence, or they're emotionally unavailable, forcing the child to create grandiose fantasy as compensation. And so during early childhood, they form the pattern. The idea is that if you can't get real validation for real accomplishments, you create fantasy validation for fantasy accomplishments. But the real self never develops properly. All right, so this is a very important idea, guys. I need you to understand this for the rest of this analysis. So before you're a child and you need psychological mirroring, you need parents who see and validate your real self, right? The problem, though, is that one parent might praise you excessively for nothing, in which case you develop grandiosity without real competence. Second is that parents might ignore your real needs, in which case you retreat into fantasy as compensation. And the third problem is that you never develop a realistic, integrated self-image. And so these children develop a split psyche. The second developmental pattern is the neglected child, who creates compensatory fantasy. So what do I mean by that? The child, when experiencing emotional unavailability or neglect, what happens is they retreat into elaborate fantasy worlds where they're special and important. So they understand that reality offers no validation, right? And when you create fantasy compensation, what happens? You learn that inner fantasy world becomes more compelling than outer reality. But when you organize self around fantasy, what do? You learn that the child spends hours in elaborate daydreams of future success and recognition, right? When you're living primarily in fantasy, you're learning that real-world effort feels empty and meaningless by comparison. And as a result, you develop split between fantasy grandiosity and real-world incompetence. And therefore, you should try your best to understand that this creates the lazy but ambitious pattern perfectly. And also, what's really important is that fantasy retreat allows psychological survival. So if you are a child experiencing neglect or emotional unavailability, well, fantasy provides necessary psychological compensation. But if the fantasy becomes the primary self-structure, you can't function in reality as an adult. You might even remain stuck in fantasy indefinitely. So understanding this developmental pathway it's basically seeing how narcissistic structure forms as adaptation. But the idea is that throughout these cases, childhood emotional neglect precedes adult lazy but ambitious pattern. And the approach will be that fantasy becomes more real than reality, and it works psychologically as defense. This is how the structure forms, and it works as childhood protection. Because remember, if you're a neglected child, you need some way to maintain self-worth. Because without fantasy compensation, you would feel worthless and unloved. There's really no other way for a child to psychologically survive emotional neglect, right? But if you carry this structure into adulthood and you still live primarily in fantasy, and you know that real effort threatens your fantasy self-structure, you become the lazy but ambitious type. And then you're trapped in a pattern formed 30 years earlier. And that's how developmental arrest creates adult dysfunction. And the third mechanism, of course, is the shame grandiosity cycle. Basically, people with this structure understand that they oscillate between feeling destined for greatness and feeling completely worthless. There's no middle ground, no realistic self-assessment. If you can't maintain grandiose fantasy, you collapse into shame and self-hatred. That's what happens when the defensive structure fails temporarily and reality intrudes. There's nothing stable about narcissistic self-structure. So as you can see, the three mechanisms work as integrated defensive system. And this is why productivity advice completely fails with this population. And even though these people appear to just need discipline or better habits, what's important for us to understand is they have a psychological structure that makes sustained effort impossible. So let me give you an example of this. This is a typical case study from psychoanalytic literature. And as you can see, the patient exhibits all three mechanisms: grandiose fantasy, perfectionist paralysis, shame grandiosity cycles. We're talking about intelligent person trapped in the pattern for decades, therapy revealing childhood developmental failures, gradual integration of split self through years of analytic work. There are specific treatment approaches documented. But what you need to understand is none of this can be addressed through willpower or productivity systems. Because, why do lazy but ambitious people keep trying the same behavioral solutions when they never work? Because they don't understand this is a psychological structure. Because culture tells them it's about discipline, not depth psychology. But you can only resolve this pattern through psychological work addressing the unconscious mechanisms. The culture requires that people see this as behavioral, not psychological. That's essential to maintaining the productivity, industry, and self-help market. But the same pattern exists everywhere, in every country, in every culture that has similar parenting patterns. And so really, the question is whether you'll keep treating this behaviorally or address it psychologically. So the choice is yours. It's a decision about what level of intervention matches the problem. So you can keep trying productivity systems and habit formation, but this path leads to repeated failure and increasing shame, because behavioral interventions can't address psychological structures. They miss the unconscious dimension entirely. They serve the self-help industry, but not people with narcissistic organization. And then you also have the alternative path where you can seek depth psychological therapy, work with clinicians trained in narcissistic structures, begin the long process of integrating the split self. You can actually resolve the pattern. So yes, we can say that the behavioral path, it's a category error because you're applying the wrong type of solution to the problem. But really, what's happened is that culture benefits from people not understanding this is psychological because the productivity industry profits from repeated failed attempts, and the therapeutic community is relatively small and expensive. And that's why this knowledge stays hidden. So we are really at a recognition point, a moment where you either keep blaming yourself for lacking discipline or understand you have a psychological structure requiring psychological intervention. And you must choose, because continued behavioral approaches guarantee continued failure. Look at any case of someone truly resolving this pattern, any therapeutic success story. Guess what, guys? They all involved psychological work addressing the unconscious mechanisms. But it requires years of committed psychological work, demands confronting painful childhood material, and involves integrating parts of self that have been split since early development. And it's still the only approach that actually works for this specific pattern. All right? Now, there's a question that people often ask. It's a very good question. The question is this: if this is a psychological structure formed in childhood, can it ever really be resolved, right? And it's a good question. And the answer is yes, but it requires proper therapeutic intervention, not self-help. Why can't lazy but ambitious people just fix themselves through willpower or better systems? Because you cannot consciously override unconscious defensive structures. As a psychological reality, you're dealing with mechanisms formed in childhood that operate outside awareness, that serve protective functions even while causing suffering, that are deeply embedded in personality structure, right? People need to understand that this isn't about being weak or undisciplined. And if you approach this as a behavioral problem, when it's actually a psychological structure, you'll fail repeatedly and deepen the shame. In fact, your repeated failures actually reinforce the pattern. So the classic example is like someone who tries productivity system after productivity system, and they fail each time despite genuine effort. And they conclude they're fundamentally broken or uniquely flawed. But guess what? They're approaching a psychological problem with behavioral tools. There's actually a well-understood clinical syndrome with established treatment approaches. There's no mystery about why productivity advice fails here. It's actually just category error, treating structural psychology as if it were habit formation. I'm not saying productivity systems are useless for everyone. And I'm not saying all lazy but ambitious people need therapy. But I am saying that for people with true narcissistic structure, the pattern won't resolve without addressing the psychological dimension. And if you keep trying behavioral solutions to structural psychological problems, guess what? You'll stay stuck indefinitely while feeling increasingly ashamed. So in some ways, you would say this is clinical wisdom meeting cultural ignorance. This pattern has been understood in psychology for over a century, but popular culture has no awareness of the psychological dimension. It is the gap between depth psychology and surface-level self-help. But unfortunately, this is the reality. So even though psychology has sophisticated understanding and treatment approaches, most lazy but ambitious people never encounter this knowledge. But then what happens when people do discover the psychological explanation? Relief combined with grief. You guys know what happens when someone realizes their 20-year struggle isn't about discipline? They experience relief that there's an explanation, combined with grief over years lost to misunderstanding. If everyone understood this was a psychological structure, not a character flaw, millions would seek appropriate help. Do you understand? The culture requires that people see this as behavioral, not psychological. That's essential to maintaining the productivity industry and self-help market. But the same pattern exists everywhere, in every country, in every culture that has similar parenting patterns. And so really the question is whether you'll keep treating this behaviorally or address it psychologically. So the choice is yours. It's a decision about what level of intervention matches the problem. So you can keep trying productivity systems and habit formation, but this path leads to repeated failure and increasing shame. Because behavioral interventions can't address psychological structures. They miss the unconscious dimension entirely. They serve the self-help industry, but not people with narcissistic organization. And then you also have the alternative path, where you can seek depth psychological therapy, work with clinicians trained in narcissistic structures, begin the long process of integrating the split self. You can actually resolve the pattern. So yes, we can say that the behavioral path, it's a category error, because you're applying the wrong type of solution to the problem. But really what's happened is that culture benefits from people not understanding this is psychological, because the productivity industry profits from repeated failed attempts, and the therapeutic community is relatively small and expensive. And that's why this knowledge stays hidden. So, we are really at a recognition point, a moment where you either keep blaming yourself for lacking discipline or understand you have a psychological structure requiring psychological intervention. And you must choose, because continued behavioral approaches guarantee continued failure. So if someone recognizes they have this lazy but ambitious narcissistic structure, what should they actually do? And this is a really practical question to answer. So let me explain the honest steps. The first step is this. You need to accept this is a psychological structure, not a behavioral problem, right? What makes resolution possible is understanding the level at which the problem exists. That's what allows proper intervention. The people who successfully resolve this tend to be those who accept they need psychological help, who find therapists trained in working with narcissistic structures, and who commit to years of therapeutic work. So how do people actually find appropriate help when most therapists aren't trained in this specific area? It's challenging, but possible, meaning that you need to specifically seek psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapists. You probably need to interview several to find one who truly understands narcissistic personality organization. And you need to commit to long-term work, not quick fixes. So, the barrier is finding qualified help and affording it. So, the honest answer is this requires resources and commitment. Then the question is, what specifically happens in therapy? And the answer, clinically, is that you work on integrating the split between grandiose self and depleted self. Not expecting quick transformation. I'm talking about years of examining how the structure formed and functions, not months. You have to explore the childhood origins of the defensive structure, face the painful reality of developmental failures, and gradually build a realistic, integrated self-image, even though this is emotionally difficult work. Does that make sense? So in the long term, you can develop genuine, integrated sense of self. You can sustain productive effort without the shame grandiosity cycle. You can engage with reality without needing defensive fantasy. But in the short term, you have to accept you have a psychological structure requiring psychological work. Find and commit to appropriate long-term therapy. Tolerate the discomfort of examining painful childhood material. And abandon hope for quick behavioral fixes. That's the realistic path, because you cannot resolve structural psychology through willpower. But therapeutic work addressing unconscious mechanisms can create real change. It requires commitment to process over years, not weeks. And that's the practical answer, because this structure took years to form in childhood. So think of it as developmental repair work. Think of someone who enters psychoanalytic therapy, where they initially resist seeing their grandiosity as defensive. And gradually, they explore childhood experiences of being overvalued but unsupported. And they begin to recognize the fantasy self as compensation. And now, they're slowly integrating a more realistic self-concept. Do you understand? So it's realistic transformation in that change happens incrementally through skilled therapeutic relationship. But you must commit to the process. If you keep trying behavioral quick fixes, you'll stay stuck forever. You'll waste decades on solutions that can't work. And what's really important is that proper psychological work actually resolves this pattern, right? So what we understand from clinical evidence is that people who engage in appropriate depth therapy can genuinely transform this structure. that integration of the split.